Okay, so we're recording. Welcome everyone to our last of the summer health chats that we're doing. We're going to move into fall here real soon with all the new announcements and things that are going to happen at the global conference with Shackley next week. I can't believe it. But tonight I'm really excited to share another health chat with my husband presenting, Dr. David Colby. And you may have heard some of the ones that he's done this summer. I have some recordings of them, and they've been excellent. So for those of you who might not be familiar with David and his background, I'll just share a few little tidbits on him. He is a doctor of pharmacy, and also he has a PhD in chemistry, and he's an associate professor at the University of Mississippi. He trains pharmacy students and works also with natural products in the Natural Products Center here. He does research in natural products and pharmaceuticals and dietary supplements, and so he's really an expert in that area, and just an all-around smart guy that's also on the field science team with Shackley, so he's a great resource for our Shackley business. And like I said, David has joined us on a couple of these this summer, which has been great. And tonight, the topic that he's going to talk about, I think, is really interesting, especially if you are in any kind of business or sales, which I know a lot of you are with Shackley. And, from David's perspective, he's going to have a unique perspective being a college professor and competing for grant money and getting publications published, which is all part of what he does and is an important part of his job. And he's going to talk about that tonight. If you saw the topic tonight, we have the topic being surprising rejection rates in marketing and also academics. So I think, like I said, his perspective will be unique and interesting. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to David to share with us. So David, go ahead.
Well, thanks, honey, for that introduction. Let me go ahead and get my screen all set up. Okay. Here we go. So I hope you all enjoy this presentation. I know you're all planning to have a nice, most of you are probably planning to have a nice trip out to Vegas, so enjoy and have some fun with that. I'm going to talk about something which probably is not really often, and that is the rejection rates that are quite common. And I'm going to talk about a number of things related to that. I mean, obviously we don't like to talk about when we fail or when we're rejected, but sometimes it's important to just understand the realities, and I'll tell you why that is. So I wanted to talk about some things that I saw very important similarities between sales and academia, because prior to me becoming a professor, I spent so much time reading about sales and marketing before I ever started my job as a professor. And the reason is because, to me, professors are professional salesmen. You have to realize that professors need to sell education to students. They need to sell proposals to funding agencies, and they also need to sell research studies to scientific journals. The only difference between a professor and someone who's a salesman in a more traditional sense is a professor has to sell education, information, and research. So professors basically ask for money, but they don't even give a real tangible product in the process. That makes things very difficult. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is many professors only have a 9-month contract. So they're only going to be paid for 9 months of the year. So they have to get money usually from getting proposals to fund them for the summer. So professors also, in many cases, will work on commissions, which are very similar to people in sales. One thing that I find that's definitely similar to being a professor is if you've ever taught to students, one of their primary concerns when they take any class is, why do I need this? Why do I need to take this? And I think that's something that's very similar if you're trying to sell a product. That's probably a primary concern of your customers. Why do I need this? Well, if you want to get good student evaluations, answering this question early, answering this question frequently really drives down the importance to your students and helps you become successful. And this is something that I had to learn. It's something that I planned for because I knew for quite a while that I wanted to be a professor. So like I said, I spent a lot of time reading many books about sales and marketing because it's so valuable being in academia. But the one thing that we don't talk about in academia is on-the-job training that has to deal with rejection, because there's lots of rejection. Teaching evaluations, if you ever want to get a tremendous amount of feedback and rejection, teach a large class, especially to college students. Your teaching evaluations, they will be happy to point out every single thing that you did wrong. This is something that can be very concerning, especially to new professors if they've never got extensive teaching evaluations, just to how critical young students can be. I mean, you see this on the internet. Someone posted something on YouTube or something on Facebook they don't like. They're going to get a whole bunch of comments. Well, this is similar to teaching evaluations. The other thing is rejecting grants. I spend a lot of my job writing grants. But what a lot of people don't realize, and even professors, especially new professors, is the funding rate is very, very small. Right now in most federal agencies, such as the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, they fund about 1 in 20 grants. What that means is you have about a 95% rejection rate. The other thing that's common is rejected manuscripts, also something that's not discussed, how difficult it is to publish in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Let me give you some of my own personal statistics. My first 13 submissions to journals for publication resulted in 11 rejections. It's a very high rejection rate. Now, some of you aren't familiar with the peer review process. What happens is you submit a manuscript to the journal editor reads it, decides whether it's appropriate for the journal, and if not, or they have concerns, they can just simply reject it. Then what they'll do is they'll hand it off, if they think it's appropriate, they'll hand it off to the associate editors that sends it out to other professors or other scientists for an anonymous blinded peer review. If they don't like it, they can recommend rejection, and then the associate editor with the editor can reject it. So the first 13 papers that I submitted as a professor, 11 of them were rejected upon first submission. Now, when this happened and I got this rejection, this probably my 13th submission, I went to faculty meeting. And I sat down next to a distinguished professor. So a distinguished professor is a professor that's normally incredibly successful, has an international reputation, and normally they published hundreds of papers. So I turned to the faculty member and I said, you know, it's really rough for me. I've submitted 13 papers and nearly all of them were rejected. I got 11 rejections. That professor turned to me and said, actually, David, you're doing a great job. Because when I first started out, of my first 20 submissions for publication, 19 were rejected. So you're at a much better start than me, and really keep going strong. And that really helped to lift my spirits at the time, because again, we don't talk about this high level of rejection where you're getting a rejection almost 90% of the time. I can even tell you for rejected grants, I had to submit 40 grant applications to get 2 funded. And that's perfectly what the funding rate is on the funding agencies. That is, you have to submit 20 grants to get 1 funded. That's a lot of work just to get 1 proposal through. So when I've been thinking about rejection, like I said, I'm going to draw some analogies between academia and sales, but I'm also going to touch on one other thing, and that's baseball. So as some of you might enjoy baseball, there's some important take-home messages, and I'll talk about that in just a bit, but I want to talk about baseball for just a minute. I want to talk about someone that most of you are familiar with, that's Babe Ruth. You know his legacy. So think for a moment, what was Babe Ruth's nickname for most of his career when he was playing in the major leagues? Secondly, what major league record did he set that lasted for 30 years? Well, the answer to those questions is actually his nickname was the King of Strikeouts. And when he finished his career, he had 1,330 strikeouts. That was a major league record that stood for over 30 years. But that's interesting here because no one remembers these things. The only thing anyone remembers is the home runs. All that anyone remembers is the productivity and the successes. We don't spend time talking or even thinking about our rejections. And it's kind of interesting if you look at some baseball statistics. In 1923, Babe Ruth struck out 93 times in a season. That was a tremendous number at the time. However, 4 years later is the season in 1927 when he got 60 home runs in a season. Now that record lasted for 34 years. That was an incredible record, and that's what most people remember about Babe Ruth. So then it comes down to this thing about tracking your productivity. And if we start thinking about salespeople, or we start thinking about professors, it's this issue of keeping records. Because if you think about professional athletes, keeping their stats is very common. For baseball, you know everything about them, how many home runs they have, how many stolen bases they have, what is their ERA, what is their batting average. You have a whole group of people that just are focused on tracking every single thing about these professional athletes. But keeping records is important, not only in academics, but I'm going to give you some information that it's also important in sales. The only issue, again, you have with this is no one tracks the stats for professors. The only thing we really track in academics are going to be our publications, our grants, as well as our high student evaluations. So even with academia, we only keep track of our successes. And our major focus is on our productivity. We really don't talk too much about the actions that are required to get papers published, to get grants funded. And although we don't talk about those activities very much, we spend even less time talking about our rejections, let alone tracking them. So you might say, why am I talking about these two concepts? Well, there's a very famous book on selling. This is one of the classics, probably the top 10. If you go into Google and say top 10 best-selling books, it's one of the books that I've read many times. I even listened to it on my audiobook when I'm in my car. And there's a very famous book on selling. It's written by Frank Bettker, How I Raised Myself from Failure to Success in Selling. I love this book. So Frank Bettker played on the St. Louis Cardinals. He was a professional athlete. However, his career ended due to injury in 1910. So this book was written, from someone's life from over 100 years ago. But after his career ended due to an injury, what was his next step for him? He was still very young. He moved into sales. He actually started selling life insurance for Fidelity. You're probably familiar with that. So I want you to think for a minute, how well could you sell if you were a professional athlete? So think about that. You're a professional athlete. Think of the confidence of being successful, playing in the big leagues. Think of all the publicity you get, all the notoriety, the professional branding. You're even a hometown hero. How well do you think you could sell if you were a professional athlete? Another way to think about it is if you had a professional, famous athlete sitting in your home asking you to buy something, would you sell? Now that's something I would think about. All right, I'm reading a book about sales from a guy who's a professional athlete. Is that an advantage or not? Well, if you think it is, I can tell that you're very inexperienced in sales, because Frank Bettker failed miserably when he tried to sell. When he moved into his job as a salesman, he failed miserably and he ended up resigning after 10 months. Sales, just like academia, is very difficult. It's not easy. Being in academia isn't easy. You really have to understand this concept of rejection. And this is what Frank Bettker talks about, that he had to learn how to really understand what rejection is. One of the other authors that I read extensively from, who spends a lot of time talking about sales, is Zig Ziglar, and he talks about it, that failure is an event, it is not a person. So Frank Bettger, in his book, How I Raised Myself from Failure to Success in Selling, he had to understand rejection, but he thought about things as a professional athlete. How do I track my statistics so I can improve my sales record? And that's what I'm going to talk about. So he gives some data. We're going to get back to baseball. Stolen bases. Let's consider 2 records for just a minute. One of the major league records, and most of you probably have heard of Ty Cobb. He was a wonderful base runner. He had 96 stolen bases. That was the league record. It lasted for many years. He accomplished that in 1915. But let's look at not the league record, the number 2 record. That was by Max Carey. He stole 51 bases in 1922. So you might be thinking, why is there such a big difference between the top record and second place? Well, let's look at these statistics, again, available for professional athletes. So Ty Cobb, he actually attempted to steal a base in one season 134 times. He failed 38 times, thus succeeding 96. So his overall success rate was 71%. That's very high. Now, success rates are obviously not that high. Success rates are not that common in sales or academia, but this is an instructive example. Because if we compare to Carey, he only tried 53 times. Now, he only failed twice, so his success rate was 96%. But there's a huge difference in people who are peak performers into their high rates of activity. Cobb tried so many more times because he was not concerned about being thrown out and failing to steal that base. And that allowed him to not only set that league record, but again, have that huge gap so that no one could even come close to him. Because Ty Cobb is much more productive, and he really set that record. So now let's get back to this story of Frank Bettger. I pulled a number of things out of this book about how he was able to rise to the top. So he started out as a complete failure. If you got into sales and you didn't resign and give up, then you're ahead of him, because he did. He worked another job, and then he said, I'm going to try this a number of times. I'm going to try this again because I want to succeed in sales. Obviously, in sales, one thing that's beneficial is if you're good at selling, the sky's the limit. You can get very large commissions. So he spent many years training for success in sales. And as a professional athlete, he also kept accurate records. And he was able to move up, slowly up the ladder into, he was one of the top salesmen in life insurance at Fidelity. Not at Fidelity, it was a different company at the time, but he got as a top salesman. So let's look at his stats. This is a top sales year for him. He made 1,849 calls. This is in 1 year, so that's about an average of 78 calls a day, 5 days a week, all year long. From his calls, he got 828 meetings. Now that's pretty good, but you have to realize that's a 55% rejection rate. Most of his calls, 1,021 calls, he didn't even get a meeting with the customer. From those 828 meetings, he got only 65 closed sales. So what that means is you're talking about 92% of his meetings that he had with customers ended in failure. So they didn't produce a sale. So you can see that these success rates match the success rates that I talked about earlier in academia. You're talking about high 90% rejection rates. So let's review. 1,848 calls resulted in 65 sales. That was a total of 1,784 failures, or a 97% rejection rate. How much money do you think that was worth with a 97% rejection rate? Think about that for a minute. Well, it resulted, now I adjusted the number he put in his book based off the time, so this is in 2018. It resulted in $112,000 in commissions in a year. That is a tremendous income to be making from sales. So it's quite successful. Now, obviously, he was a top salesman, so getting very good pay. That's what people focus on. They look at the sales, but they don't see this high rate of rejection that's really embedded in them. So now let's get back into academia. Let's talk a little bit about publishing. I'm going to talk about one of my colleagues at the University of Mississippi, that's James Payne. He is a professor of education at the University of Mississippi. He has written many books as well as publications on education, and he's also written books on the arts of sales. And this is one of his successful books. It's called People-Wise Selling, The Art of Selling Brain to Brain. So one of his research projects is he wanted to look at the success of a book proposal. So in order to do this, they developed a book proposal. Him and his research staff developed and vetted a really solid proposal for a book. And they proceeded to send it out to literary agents to see how many of these agents would be interested in publishing this book. So let me tell you, they sent it out to 377 literary agents, received 327 rejections. 36 didn't even bother to respond. So they only got 14 agents that were interested in moving forward with the book. Again, 96% rejection rate. Now I can tell you this, I've spoken to James, I've had lunch with him on this. Now that we're more established professors, we kind of laugh at the high rejection rate because it's almost humorous. And I can tell you something about this study that he published. He actually published this study. When they first went out, they ran a pilot study. That is, they were trying to see what they needed to do to get the statistical data to validate their success rates in looking at these book proposals. Their pilot study, they only sent out to 39 literary agents. And because the rejection rate was so high, they had to increase for the actual study almost 10 times. And he was amazed. He knew that the rejection rate was high, but he laughs at this because he's like, I did not realize that it was this bad. So they started out with 39 literary agents, but for the actual study, they had to multiply it by 10 so they could get the data they need for this study on book proposals. And he thought that was very funny. And I do too, now that I'm more experienced as a professor. And things really have changed in my career as I've really understood the reality of rejection as it relates to academia. And honestly, one of the things that I'm most concerned about now is probably the biggest problem for new professors is they're just going to drown in the sea of rejection. Because like I was unaware of high rejection rates. I was also unprepared for high rejection rates. And this is very similar to sales and also Frank Bettger. You know, when you start out as a professor, you're inexperienced. Inexperienced is not really a problem. It's to be expected. The biggest issue that I see with the new professors that join the University of Mississippi is, again, they're just unaware of this. You know, it's associated with the grants they submit, publications they submit, and even the teaching evaluations that they get. And it's interesting to me that I'm mentoring new faculty, and I'm kind of in this strange world where they're getting that, you know, they're starting to set their boat afloat in this sea of rejection. And I'm just sitting there carefully watching them because they don't know how much more effort they need to expend before they can get their first successes. So now let's get back to this book, How I Raised Myself from Failure to Success by Frank Bettger. And he tracked his stats. Remember, he's a professional. He came from a background as a professional athlete. So in addition to rising to the top in sales, He wanted to become a peak performer. So he looked very carefully at his stats. And he found some information. I think this is something why, as a professor, I keep very accurate stats and very accurate records of everything I do. What he noticed is, for himself, 70% of his sales came from the first interview. 23% of his sales came from the second interview, but only 7% of his sales came from the third interview and also the fourth, fifth, and subsequent. But what he noticed when he was looking at his time cards is most of his time in sales was spent on the third interview, the fourth interview, and the fifth, constantly trying to get his customers that weren't buying to buy. So what was his solution? And I think this is perfectly valid. And I think about this as a professor when I try to increase my own productivity, is sometimes you can't work any harder. There aren't any more hours in the day. People are very busy. You can't, if you want to succeed more in sales, a lot of times you just can't make more sales calls. You can't do more reach outs. You don't have time in the day. So what he decided to do is, if I want to be more successful, I need to finish my sales efforts for each customer after the second interview. After the second interview, I'm going to give them everything they need. So if they want to make a sale, they can contact me. But I'm done. Now that frees up the majority of his time. But like I said, he became a peak performer in sales. He then identified the problem he had, and he got a solution. Now I need to spend my time training to get more good first interviews with customers. So how much was this strategy work? It resulted in $209,000 in 1 year in sales commissions. To me, that is astounding. There are very few salespeople that can claim that they've almost made $250,000 in commissions in 1 year. So his advice from this book, and I think it's very good advice, whether you're in sales or academia, is to keep your records. And his other advice is be inspired by your rejection. And this is something that I've learned in my own career. So when I became a professor, shortly after, my family, we like to go on family vacations. And I know Rebecca's online. She most certainly remembers this. On our first family vacation after I was a professor, the day before we went on vacation, I received an email from an editor of a journal. I just submitted them a publication. The review was completed, and the title of the subject line of the email was "Decision on Your Manuscript." And I was excited. I opened it, and not surprising, again, I was very naive. I didn't know. It said, "Thank you for the submission, but we have rejected this manuscript." Now, I know Rebecca knows this because I was not a happy camper on this vacation. I was in a bad mood. Probably it was in a bad mood until we started driving home. And I promised myself at that time, I said, "David, I will never open another letter from the editor prior to going on vacation." Now that I've been in academia much longer, I laugh at that thought. Actually, on one of our most recent vacations, same thing happened. I got a letter back from a journal editor, and I knew that there was rejection in there. But like I said, it's different. I opened that email knowing that I was going on vacation. Surprise, surprise, it said, "Thank you for the submission, but again, we've come to the decision that we must reject it." Now, I didn't feel bad at this at all. Actually, now that I know the game, when we submitted the paper, I went to my staff in my research lab and I said, "We need to do more work. Although this is an excellent submission, there are a few things, and if the editors and reviewers see that, they might not like it, and this paper might get rejected. So let's carry out these studies so that way when the decisions come back, we'll be ready to move if we need." So now that I got the rejection, we had the data, we had the studies completed, I put it in the revised manuscript, I sent it to another journal, And I left on our vacation in a much better mood. I was ready because I got that paper off my desk. We sent it to another journal out for review. So I smile at that because I think of how different my experiences are now compared to how they were. And that just had the understanding and being inspired from rejection. And this is something that I'll end our webinar today. It's a final story about rejection. It's something that I know Rebecca is familiar with. It's actually written in detail in Frank Bettger's book. So a final story here is about a life of failure. Think about, these are facts from someone's life. Think about if this was actually you. Failed in their first run for state legislature. They were interested in being a politician. They didn't succeed. They entered into business and their business failed. But it didn't just fail, it failed miserably. And they had to spend the next 17 years of their life paying off debt. So in the process, this person met a girl, fell in love, got engaged, and prior to being married, their fiance died. Things aren't going good. This person wanted to be a politician, so they ran for Congress again. This time, they were beaten very badly. What next? Well, we're not in an elective office. We need to get a job. So they tried to get an appointment at the U.S. Land Office. If we can't work as a politician in the federal government, let's get a job in the federal government. And they were denied with their job application. So they gave it one more time. They ran for the U.S. Senate and failed again. Now, can you guess who this man is? This man was Abraham Lincoln. He became, despite all of this rejection, President of the United States of America. And one of his quotes, very common quote about Abraham Lincoln, and I think it's fitting to end this webinar about rejection using a quote from him. My greatest concern is not whether you have failed, but it's whether you are content with your failure. And that's where I'm going to end this webinar. Thanks for listening tonight. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And if not, definitely enjoy your trip when you go to your global meeting for Shacklin.
Well, thank you, David. That was super interesting to me. And I hope you all found the same. Does anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts? I'm getting a couple chats for, thanks so much, David. Great insights. Thank you. Couple things that I was kind of jotting some notes down that you said earlier on that just reminded me of something that I've heard so many times in Shackley for the field, distributors, when people, starting off, like it's kind of the same thing. We're starting off and we get excited. We have this new business and this is gonna be great. And I'm gonna go right up the track to master coordinator. And then you get the no's. And people will say, what's the difference between, a master coordinator, for those of you who don't know, that's the top rank in our company at Shackley, and basically the rest of us, is they've just heard more no's. And I know that there's some master coordinators on the call tonight that I'd imagine could attest to that. And so that's always a good reminder that it's not a straight shot with whatever, area we're in. There's going to be the bumps. And if some of you might be familiar with the book, Go for No, some of the things that David talked about tonight kind of reminded me of that book that I've read before, which I recommend as well. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments for questions?
I was just going to say, Rebecca, when we first started our Shackley business, we were told to get excited with the no's because we were that much closer to a yes. So we kind of did a happy dance if we got a no.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, we can't be discouraged with that because that's just part of it, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you're going to get more no's than you're ever going to get yeses. So you might as well just face the fact and be happy with it. So
that's right. That's right. No, that's a good point. Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments, questions? One thing I wanted to kind of draw out when David was talking about, from an academic standpoint, from a professor standpoint, the amount of rejections they get for publications. And I think the latest number I've heard from Shackley is that we have 135 or maybe a little bit more than that in scientific publications, and most of those are in top peer-reviewed journals. And like David was saying, that's not an easy feat. So, again, that's part of our difference, and something to be really, highlighting as we're sharing with people, and to be proud of, because it's unique. Anybody else have any questions for David?
Along that same line is regarding Steve. He worked at the university for 40 plus years, and he has about 120 publications, but it took him 40 years to get 120.
Yeah. Yeah,
not easy. There were a lot of remakes, I can tell you, on the publications when he sent, and had to do more calculations, had to do another experiment. He didn't like this, he didn't like that. Need to run this experiment, so.
Right. No, yeah, you know that life.
Yeah.
David, there was a question about the book that you mentioned, which I'm guessing is the last one you were talking about. Is it out of print? It's not on Amazon, was the question.
Oh no, I just I'll put my slide back up. If you still have the screen sale. This book is a classic. I actually just purchased this copy from Amazon. Frank Bettker, you can definitely search for the author. I know it's also an audiobook. You can also buy it on eBay as well. Like I think it was published in maybe the 30s or the 40s. So it's definitely available. And yeah, they can probably actually find it at their library if they want.
Yeah, she said she had the spelling wrong. She just typed that in. So yeah, you should be able to find that online.
Yeah, it's a good one. There's a lot of really good advice in the book on so many things. And like I said, it doesn't just apply to sales. It applies to many other things as well.
And I think that's a good point too. Being in sales, I think that the whole personal development piece is so important. And for me, when I get discouraged with my business, reading a book or listening to a podcast or coming on a webinar or doing something, even just exercising, getting away or doing something fun for you, I think it's important to kind of have that balance, but it can help to gear us back up and kind of, get back out there without, feeling discouraged when we're getting the rejections or the no's. And a lot of times it's a not now, right? So anybody else have any questions or comments, thoughts for David, questions for him? I'll stop the recording.